Today is our 23rd of Elul. In Rabbi speak, that means we've got a week before the sermon starts. So after this, I will go right back into pondering all kinds of other things for us to share as our tradition. But what we do in the month of Elul is there's supposed to be an opportunity of reflection and learning. I know some of you have been on other Zooms or other programs from some of the synagogues around town. It's so lovely that LA has a collaboration of synagogues that are willing to do things so that we can really enhance and learn more altogether. And when thinking about what to teach, I was obviously reflecting on this notion of forgiveness and what will happen during the holidays, but I was very struck by what this last year has felt like. It's impossible to reflect on the holidays without reflecting on the moments that lead up to the holidays. And it was last year on Simchat Torah that October 7th happened. And so there has been an entire year now where a lot of my thoughts and my feelings have been filtered through the chaos of the world, of our community, of what's been going on, the complexity, the tragedy, all of it. And so while thinking about forgiveness, I was stuck with this idea that as a kid, I would hear forgive and forget. Right? That when you forgive, if you can forget and move forward, there is something really powerful to what you can do with your life. And being struck by this notion, like, I am ready for Rosh Hashanah. I am ready for my days of atonement. I am ready to forgive those who approach me and ask me if I will release them from the wrongs they have made. But I don't know if I'm ready to forget, because there's certain forgetting that I'm just not willing to do. Right? There's certain forgetting that we as a community have really leaned into. We have said, never forget, right? We've said never again, that we won't forget the tragedies of the Holocaust. And that has been such a powerful piece of guiding us throughout this last year on how we hold ourselves as a community. And so I want to start with that idea of forgiveness, but I want to then get into what I think the rabbis are really going to point to when it comes to forgetting. So obviously in Jewish thought, forgiveness is fundamental, right? We have the holiday coming up for it. And but the concept of forgiving but not forgetting is approached with a real nuance and practice inside of our tradition. And so forgiveness, right? We've got the obligation, moral obligation to forgive. According to the Talmud, Yom Kippur is an atonement for sin between God and people, but for sin between one person and another, Yom Kippur does not atone until the wrong person forgives the offender. Forgiveness is therefore a moral imperative, because otherwise you are stopping someone else from a divine engagement. So forgiveness is important. And this notion of forgiveness also plays into the difference between remembering and forgetting, and forgiveness plays into this as well, right? So the practical wisdom, right? The rabbis recognize that while forgiveness heals relationships, forgetting an offense might not always be the best practice for our safety. The rabbis go even further by re-quoting a piece of the Bible. In Deuteronomy, it says, remember what Amalek did to you. And so we often will gravitate to this and say, forgetting is not accepted in Judaism, because we have to remember Amalek. We have to remember when we've been wronged or poisoned as a community. We have to protect ourselves from these notions. And the reality is there's even an emotional realism to it, right? Judaism acknowledges human emotions on a regular basis. So forgiveness is a process that might not immediately erase the hurt or distrust caused to an offense. The rabbi then teach it's acceptable to work through feelings over time and forgive and mend. So we know that forgiveness is something worth celebrating. Forgiveness is something worth acknowledging. Forgiveness is something, quite frankly, that the rabbis teach don't wait until Yom Kippur. There is actually a blessing inside of our daily prayers, that tachanun, that acknowledges the mistakes we've made. And if we're constantly acknowledging our mistakes, we would likely be better at forgiving those who come to us with those issues too. And so forgiveness becomes a really important piece of this. Now, there's a balance between forgiveness and memory as well, right? There's this idea of ethical vigilance, right? Remembering an offense does not mean holding on to grudges or seeking revenge. Instead, it's about maintaining awareness. Therefore, you can forgive, but you can also be vigilant, a little bit weary. You can approach a relationship differently, and it might take time to build back up to it, because we obviously are going to protect ourselves or our community. And then there's the idea of personal growth. If we reflect on past experiences, even painful ones, it contributes to this idea of personal and spiritual development, and it allows others to make these informed decisions. So the rabbis really do. That was a run through of how the rabbis approach forgiveness. They really do consider it a vital component of Jewish life. fostering this idea of reconciliation and peace, but they also understand that forgetting an offense is not always possible. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Let's put forgiveness aside for a minute. Let's just focus on the word forget. It turns out that while you might have a great capacity for memory, the ability to cultivate the appropriate forgetfulness is actually a necessary requirement in living a meaningful life, according to the rabbis. Tana Deve Eliyahu, a beautiful midrash, quotes another rabbinic ancient text that says, "Who is truly wealthy? One who is content with their portion." Piece of Mishnah Avot. And the sage Tana Deve Eliyahu asks, who would be the richest of all? And they supply the answer to their own question: God. But there's a catch. If God remembers everything, then what God would remember is our abundant shortcomings, our bickering, our disappointments, our pettiness, our violence. How is it possible for God to be happy while being burdened by all of our stuff? How is it possible for God to celebrate when God involuntarily is going to remember all these tragedies and pains? And so in the words of Midrash, God deliberately remembers the good, deliberately forgets the bad, for the reason that God is content with God's lot. The Jewish tradition acknowledges that profound value in the process of forgetting and relearning Torah. The rabbis teach that this cycle can lead to deeper understanding, renewed passion, spiritual growth, that there's so many different ways that forgetting actually gives us access to being able to remember. It's a deeper understanding. The Talmud says that each time we revisit Torah, we uncover a new layer of meaning. And forgetting allows for the Torah to be approached with freshness. Because the first time we learn something is there's different spark to it. And if we can truly forget something, it means that we get the opportunity to relearn. In fact, there's a teaching that goes even further that says, the luckiest of scholars are the ones that have forgotten more Torah than they've ever learned. That there's actually a gift to forgetting the very things you learn. And that if you are one who can forget your Torah, you are one who can relearn your Torah. And Torah is learned how? Where do we learn Torah? In community. Which means every time we forget and still have that drive to learn Torah, we are driven back into the arms of our community to learn once again. It's this beautiful cycle in which the rabbis celebrate a very thing that we often approach with fear and trepidation and pause. And there's a spiritual humility to it. Forgetting reminds individuals of their human limitations, right? Fostering this humility, that humility is considered a virtue in the Torah study, right? In the world of study, it allows one to open their hearts and their mind to receiving wisdom more fully. Those who have not forgotten sometimes don't live with that level of humility because the sheer confidence alone of our recall. Now, what an interesting place to stop for a second. The rabbis are literally noting a subconscious or at least non-intentional attribute, the ability to remember, might be an obstacle in the depth of learning Torah. What do you think that tells you about their approach to Torah? What do you think it tells you about the rabbis and their approach? I know what I think it tells me, but I want to give other people a chance first.
It just feels like a very open-minded and flexible approach, which feels modern, even though
it's ancient.
They're ancient, yeah.
Yeah, it's my favorite part about Judaism.
Yeah.
What feels modern
Yeah.
that is ancient.
Yeah.
I also think it has something to do with the intention of Torah study. The word study is always a distractor from the actual purpose, right? We do not study with a goal orientation in mind in Judaism. We study for the communal engagement of study, for celebrating that our minds have the ability to absorb, even if they have the ability to release what they've absorbed as well. That we have the ability to connect with others on this deeper level of learning. And so the rabbis, I actually think it hints towards the purpose of Torah study, which is that the version you learn when you're 20 and then relearn when you're 40 and learn when you're 60 is different than the Torah that you're going to finally extract when you're 80. And that if you stop because you think you've achieved the study of that Torah, like I love a good bucket list person. When someone goes, this year I'm going to focus on this. I love those people. but Torah can't be one of them. And when they say, I spent a year studying Torah, I go, a year? I'm so glad you tried that first year. What about year 2? I am on my 8th year with Torah study at KI. And there are people that have been in that room for 25. It changes, it dances around, it flips, it shifts. But every time we come back to the text, it's different. And so when you do something once and then don't return to it, the rabbis would say that's fine if you want to learn a new trick. But if you want to learn something about your soul, if you want to engage in the full breadth of our tradition, you have to be around long enough to forget all the things you've learned. There's a lot more to go into, but I found something that totally blew my mind that I didn't intend to find that I really want to share. In trying to understand this notion of forgetfulness, I dove deeper into Torah, and I actually found a piece related to Ki Titzei. In our portion of Ki Titzei, it's going to talk about some of the ways of protecting those in need. And the Bible has 3 main ways that it protects the needy inside of our agricultural biblical tradition. Peah, the edge of the field, right? Leaving the edge of the field. When you talk to someone who has peot on their payas on their face, it's because they believe their mind is the crop, right? And they're actually leaving just a bit more for the mitzvot of the world. I think it's to play with and focus and twirl, but that's a whole nother circumstance. The next, the gleanings that drop on the ground while the harvester's collecting. So if you're collecting grapes and grapes fall on the ground, you're not supposed to pick up those grapes. Anything that hits the ground while pulling off the vine, you leave, not because it's disgusting or because there's a problem with it, but because then it says to someone in need, this has been intentionally left for me. And then, shechicha, forgotten crops. Let's say a stalk or a row of a section of the field, and when harvesting your crop, you leave it, and you walk 20 feet away, and you remember that you forgot to go to the last row. Our tradition says you leave that last crop. When you reap the harvest in your field and overlook part of the field, do not turn back and get it. It will go to the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, in order that God may bless all else that you have. Of these 3 mitzvot, we're focusing on the one that's to forget. Now, here's what's so amazing about this piece of Torah. Our sages point out that there's something extraordinary about this one mitzvah. It makes it distinct from the other 612. The first 612 are mitzvot you can plan in advance to do. Mitzvot that you can strategize through your day. But this mitzvah, you cannot plan in advance, and it can only be performed after a mistake. You can't intentionally leave a row. That's just a misreading of Peah. You have to accidentally forget to do part of the harvesting. And once you do, a special mitzvah can be unlocked. A mitzvah that if you don't forget, cannot be done. Only someone who's made this mistake can actualize this mitzvah. This is so strange in Torah, that the Torah gives us the gift preemptively of saying, over the years, you're going to forget. And we want that celebrated so deeply that you get to unlock a bonus mitzvah that you can't get to unless you are too preoccupied and forget something. And the Tosefta, a piece of rabbinic writing, is actually going to dive into it further. They're going to tell a story is told of a certain pious man who forgets a sheep in his field. And he says to his son, go and sacrifice on my behalf a bull for the burnt offering and a bull for our peace offering. This is gratitude and rejoicing. It's from our offerings. And his son replied, Abba, what makes you want to celebrate the joy of this particular mitzvah more than all the other mitzvahs of the Torah? Why is it that after you forgot part of your crop, you are sending me to the temple for celebration? And he says, God has given all the other mitzvot in Torah to be observed consciously, but this one is observed unconsciously. We were able to observe this on our own, one on our own deliberate free will, but on our own deliberate free will, we never would have had the opportunity to do it. But we're told to, when you reap the field and you overlook it, that Torah gave it for a blessing. That there is almost something worth celebrating when we recognize these hiccups. We recognize these mistakes, and we recognize our forgetfulness. It's a perfect example of the argument of call the chomer is this name of the argument. If when a person has no deliberate intention of performing a mitzvah, it is nonetheless recognized and reckoned to him as merit, then how much more is a person who's deliberately performed a mitzvah, right? Why would they be different? Someone deliberately does it versus someone doing the mitzvah. The mitzvah still happens. And the Torah says there's going to be enough places in our life where we beat ourselves up for consciousness and intentionality. But here, we're getting the chance to actually celebrate something, even though we may not have actually known it was going to happen. And the rabbis are teaching several different beautiful things at once in that insight, right? The first is the pure delight to have the unexpected opportunity to do a mitzvah. Should we not walk around this world excited by the notion of being surprised by our own ability to do mitzvah? Even more so, that it's the fact, a wondrous way of viewing the world as a place filled with all kinds of mitzvot. Imagine how that sort of consciousness changes the way we view the world. That even in our mistakes, we find the opportunity to engage. I love this. And further, the mitzvah shed some of the spiritual light on the season of tshuva, right? We're going into the idea of forgiveness and forgetting. And for this one mitzvah, shechicha, can only be given after a mistake has happened. So the landowner, the person who's harvesting the crops, has messed up by missing part of their own harvest. But now they have an ability not only to do good, what does that drive them to do for themselves? You were going to beat yourself up if you forgot part of the task. If you missed the chance to maximize for your family's well-being and security, and yet here, not only are you going to get to do a mitzvah, once you have unlocked a new opportunity, it's pretty hard to still be mad at yourself. And right off the bat, you internally get the opportunity to learn the thought of forgiveness. Yeah, Robin. No, okay. I saw your hand up. I'm not putting you on the spot, not to worry. Yes, Rebecca.
What comes to mind in both this section that you're talking about and the previous one, reading the Torah anew every year, is the word innocence. So when you have to reread the Torah every year, it's almost like you're approaching it with innocence, newness, something that has not been experienced before. And that seems the same to me with forgetting that you didn't reap the last grapes off of the last row of the vineyard. It's almost like an innocent mistake that becomes a mitzvah. And I came across a quote yesterday that says, don't you know your imperfections is a blessing?
Yeah, I love that. One of my favorite things, both in the context of teaching and in the context of dadding, right, is watching as students or my children discover something that I had the chance to fall in love with. So it's either something like when I first taught my son this summer to ride a bike, and now, by the way, he's a nut job. He he will ride like 10 or 15 miles, and he's 7 years old. And I'm like, this madness needs to stop, right? But when he first, I saw his face when the full confidence kicked in, not the wobbly confidence, not the lucky I didn't fall this time confidence, but when the full confidence kicked in, and he was like, the world just got more open because I can ride there in 2 minutes. Because we went from Temescal Canyon all the way over and had a muffin and a cup of coffee at Shutters. Let's not get into how expensive that was for a muffin and coffee. And then back to Temescal Canyon, right? And to him, like a part of the world's unlocked. He couldn't do a 12-mile loop. We went further than that, right? Like there's no way he could have done that. But now he can. And I remember thinking, I remember when the world got bigger. And then I remember when the world became more accessible. Or we'll be in this classroom and I'll be talking about something with the tradition, and we'll use a trick that just kind of like opens up and sparks something. And you see the look on your students' faces when they discover something that you discovered and the power that you felt, that moment. And that's always been something that you, first of all, get excited for being able to give and then long for once you lose again. But here, the rabbis say, that same feeling, what happens when you get to relive the aha moment? What a gift to forget. Now, again, I obviously don't want to downplay that forgetfulness has a tragic side to it, and a part that is very scary, and something that is worth trying to continuously be doing the different things that help to sharpen our minds and reduce the chances of that kind of serious forgetfulness. But there's two truths that have to be extracted there. One, there's a different kind of forgetfulness, the kind in which I rewatch a movie and I don't realize until minute 47 that I've seen the movie, right? Like if you are halfway through a movie before you remember that you've seen it, you do not remember the movie. And my wife likes to say, I don't think we liked this movie very much. And I'm like, yeah, but I need to finish till the end of it now. And she's like, I feel like this is what happened last time, right? Like we watched the movie, we didn't like it much, we finished it for the sake of it. And then I completely forgot it because it just wasn't big enough for me to dwell on afterwards. And then there's a different piece to this. When painful forget happens, when the kind of forgetfulness happens that we worry about seeing our loved ones go through, during that time that there is that kind of forgetfulness, there's also this weird relief and joy in the person who has forgotten some of these things. And it's a weird kind of struggle to sit with, where suddenly, I watched it with my grandmother, and the laughter of hers that I had never heard, because it was a laughter that she had to forget certain things before she re-unlocked that laughter. And there was a trade to it of re-explaining who I was some of the time when I walked in the room. But that laughter was a gift.
There's grace in forgetfulness. My mother, who some of you might know, who comes to Torah study, forgets every wrong that's ever been done to her. And it's a grace to her because she never holds a grudge. She can't stay angry for more than 2 days because she can't remember whoever wronged her. And so there's some of that grace as well, that you can get beyond grudges or anger or feeling resentful because of forgiveness.
We are kids for a very small percentage of our lives. But there's this psychological phenomenon where in our heads, we actively always consider college and below to be about half of our lives. No matter how far out of college we get, we always think about our lives like pre and post college, right? And in our heads, even if we've known, like Jen and I have been out of college and we're still in the proximity, but we've been together half our lives. Okay. But I still feel like I just finished college. I have a kid who will go to college in less years than I'm away from college, and I still feel like I just finished college, right? You've got kids who are in college, and you still think about a demarcation of time partially being you post-college. It's this psychological phenomenon. We will always treat our childhood as 50% of our life, no matter how beautiful and how much life we live. And that doesn't take away from the rest of life. It's actually a statement about the power of those childhood years. The obligation of the homes that we build for our children, the kind of world that we want to see for them, the motivation that I see in so many grandparents as they want to influence the 18 years, the 20-ish years that they're going to have with their grandchildren when they're still children before their story tips into the other side. And I love this for two reasons. Because in that grace of forgetfulness, we also often, I'm pretty sure my grandmother stepped back into that first part, something that she had kind of like misplaced, a laughter, a silliness, or whatever it might be. But in Pirkei Avot, the ethics of our rabbis, the ethics of our fathers, there's this one 420, you don't have to look it up, but I'll give it to you anyways, where Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrkanos compares someone who studies Torah and forgets to a mother who gives birth and then, and this is back in this time, has to leave their child, has to bury their child, has to be in a life without their child. While the imagery is really stark, it underscores the importance of striving to retain Torah knowledge, yet acknowledging the pain and reality of forgetting. Now, the reason the rabbis say this is you don't forget a child who you've, but in many of the circumstances, especially in the time of writing this piece of Mishnah, they went on in pursuit of having more children. Because if you go to the Israel Museum, you will see that there was even a burial mechanism for those under 2. Because back in the time of 2,000 years ago, your chances of survival went up like multitudes, past the age of 2.5, which is why mitzvot are begun to teach at 3. Because God forbid something happens, the tradition wasn't want to add in more grief. Now I want to spend a moment and push against that a little bit. Because when I read this piece, what I expected Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrkanos to say is that one who forgets Torah is like a mother who forgets labor. People say labor is this, I witnessed it, did not experience it 3 times. And my wife's something so profound to me, like 20 minutes after our first son was born, she said, labor is labor, right? It is unlike anything you will ever be able to explain. And it is already clear that God gave me a gift of forgetting just enough of it that I'll probably be willing to do this again. And then months later, I've forgotten more of it. And then at some point it was, labor is labor, but you can no longer reflect and sit in the visceral experience of it, which is what makes you go, I'll do that again. And are we willing to, if we remember every stark bit of a traumatic moment, would we actually be able to bring ourselves to do it again, even if the payout is profound? That there is a gift of forgetting in this moment, because it allows you to re-involve yourself with something that otherwise logic would say only people who are insane put themselves back in to situations like labor. You get there into the room and you see the little chart, and it has a watermelon at the end of the chart, and it starts with, I don't even remember, a quarter. I don't remember what the first one is. And you look and you go, this doesn't feel right. Now, that's my bias, by the way, because it took me when I first started, I didn't understand any of the process. I don't know any of it, but I love that version. I love this notion that to forget Torah is like to forget the pains of labor. You're going to go into it again. You're going to be willing to indulge in it again. You're not going to hold a grudge against your children and be like, every time you look at them, do you know how painful you were? That goes away. The same, by the way, with sleep deprivation during the first few months of infancy. I tell new parents, pick a series that you want to watch, that you know you don't have time for. Watch that series. You'll forget half of it. That's fine. But those 3 months go in a blur. And then you forget how torturous the sleep deprivation was, and you just get to move on. You'll never forget the notion that it was torturous, but you have forgotten the actual tangible torture in it.
Study is struggle.
Not only a study struggle, but if you don't forget it, you're not willing to re-engage in it. And so you have to forget certain bits of Torah. Otherwise, you won't go back into seeking it again. I actually worry about that with the recall of the internet these days, because I know I have looked up the same idea before. But if you're really good at Google, how do you know if you've looked something up before? It changes its color on the hyperbar. It goes to purple from blue. And so there was a meme at one point of someone looking up things about Alzheimer's and all the results already being purple, right? And it's funny when you realize, but then you go, they're robbing me of part of the gift. I'm at some point going to have to dwell on, have I already thought about this before? And the rabbis say the aha moments that you get from study of Torah is a gift. There's also the piece of the blessing of repetition, right? Talmud, there's this piece that tells of Rabbi Preda, who taught that he taught the student the same lesson 400 times until the student understood it. And the story highlights, obviously, patience and persistence in learning, and suggested that repetition, even necessitating by forgetting, because there's no way the student learns something 400 times unless they truly could not retain most of it, is a valuable part of the educational process. That sometimes we have to learn and learn and learn and learn it again, learn it from a different direction, twist it and turn it and reevaluate it. Any other thoughts on that before I go forward? I know that was like I keep dumping a lot of stuff in. Rebecca, I don't know if people are able to unmute. They are, right? Okay. So let's talk about the power of relearning. Not just the learning, not just the motivation for it, but relearning. Rediscovering forgotten teachings can rekindle a kind of excitement and love, especially for Torah. And this renewed enthusiasm can make the learning more impactful than the initial study. I often tell people that Judaism is an adult religion. The reason we teach it to children is because that is when we have access to do that in this society. But more than that, without the foundational blocks, getting to the deep adult learning is impossible. But it's also for this thing that I love to watch, when people remember just this one spark of something they learned from childhood, but now reimagined through an adult frame. That enthusiasm for that learning is almost infectious, right? It's a beautiful thing to watch and to witness. And so there's something really powerful there. And on top of it is the resilience of learning. We talk about resilience in this world, right? But the idea of resilience with relearning is spiritual intellectual resilience. That we have to be willing to be confronted by the very thing that we realize we actually don't know, even though we think we know it. It builds a wherewithal in us that allows us to approach this world differently. And it also, overcoming the challenge of forgetting, strengthens one's commitment and dedication to Torah. Truly, the rabbis say, a blessed one is one who has forgotten more Torah than they will ever learn. And you have to think about the ramifications of all that. Let's talk about the Kabbalists. I like the Kabbalists. I bring them up a lot when I can. Jurat HaKelem, the breaking of the vessels, is something that I really believe that the Kabbalists give us as a gift in our tradition. The concept of breaking is seen as a precursor to higher rectification, to higher building, that God shatters God's self to open up for the world around us. But they also see, the reason they tell that story is so that in our world, when we break, we recognize that the breaking is just the potential for repair. That if we are to do tikkun olam, if we are supposed to repair this world and repair our own souls and repair our relationships during this time of tshuva and during these holy days, then how do you do that if nothing is broken? I've taught in Torah study before, but we'll see if Miriam has forgotten it or not. This idea that the rabbis are actually very worried about the Messiah. The rabbis, in fact, start to write about their concern if the Messiah actually shows up. Now, in a traditional space, they pray for the Messiah every service. They have full extra rounds of the Amidah just to make sure that the messianic opportunity is there. At the end of Siman Tov and Mazel Tov, David Melech, at the end of Havdalah, we have the notion of the Mashiach being part of it. The Messiah is a pretty integral part of the hopes and dreams of Judaism. And the rabbis teach they are very concerned what will happen if the Messiah comes. Because in an age of the Messiah, the world is what? It's perfect. But our mitzvot are our commandments, right? And we do mitzvah by working through an imperfect world. And the rabbis say, if the world is perfect, there will be no motivation to do mitzvot. And a world without mitzvah is not perfect. And so the rabbis realize that they've set themselves up, that there's a trap. If the Mashiach comes, there will be no more motivation for mitzvot. The people will turn against its own teaching because the very need to do the thing that grounds them in their tradition will be removed. And they realize they can't have that. So the rabbis start worrying against their own prayers. Think about that. That if the very thing they want happens, then the very beauty of the tradition gets lost. You think of other circumstances where that same kind of conundrum happens? I'm looking at it right now in the world with political activism. Do I want our politics to be less insane? Absolutely. Am I deeply proud of some of the voices that I've seen step up and learn to share their voice for the sake of their world? I took 30 kids to DC last year, and their enthusiasm to be there was partially because they feel that there is brokenness to fix. Go even more personal. I would do anything for October 7th not to have happened. I would do anything for this last year to not feel like the holidays just happened and yet they must have happened 10 years ago because of the continuity and numbness from this last year. And when I was teaching last Tuesday night in this room, I looked around and I have 20 high school kids in my class on Israel, and 18 of them have 3-inch or bigger Jewish star necklaces, highs, their Hebrew name, a mezuzah. Like, when I'm not talking about a little charm, I'm talking about Jewish bling. They are all rocking it. Like, I've got this little tag. They've got like that's a ring, Rabbi. Like we're wearing like their pride and their tradition. And I bar and bat mitzvah these kids. That pride grew, and that pride is a byproduct of someone challenging their very essence, and that's awful, but that's beautiful. And so the brokenness in this world is a necessary piece of our experience. And so the rabbis believe that God's gift to us being able to forget allows us to weather and manage and comprehend how we can be in such a world that needs the devastation for the beauty, that needs devastation for beauty, for regrowth, that needs the ashes for the new plants to grow more vibrant. This is so complex. This human experience is so complex that we need a mechanism to make sure that we don't spiral out of control in our own minds.
Why we forget every minute of the day that we're going to die. Because if we thought about that constantly, how could we go on? We have to remember it to know how
to appreciate, and
we have to live without thinking about that constantly.
Parents often today will look and be like, I remember as a kid, someone just pointed this one out, and it actually kind of blew my mind. As a kid, I don't remember a single year, kindergarten through senior year of high school, that someone was not in a cast in one of my classes at all times.
Yeah.
Someone had something broken at all times. I remember when it was me, and my left arm was casted up because I broke my wrist. It's a longer story. We won't get into it, but not one kid in any of my kids' classes have a cast. Now, one could say we've gotten better at this parenting thing, and they're breaking less bones. And someone else could say they're spending a lot less time outside and a lot less time on playgrounds and a lot less time wrestling around, and because they're sitting more sedentary. I don't have the right answer, but I do know that none of my friends who broke a bone complain about it today. It didn't stay with them in a way that changed them it was a part of the experience, a byproduct of the adventure, of the exploration, of the excursions, of the risks, of all of these things. And so then we had to sit with like, well, shouldn't there be more casts? Doesn't that mean that kids took more risks? I don't want to be that guy. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it's a really interesting thing to point out. Like back in when I was a kid, we went outside.
Yeah, it's a trope.
Yeah. I remember being told what time to get home for dinner. I could go anywhere in the neighborhood as long as I was home by that time for dinner. I brought that up to my wife the other day. I said, I was in second grade for sure. I was climbing the tree in the front. She goes, no, Leo, I cannot just leave. I was like, we do live in the Palisades.
But there's the judgment.
We moved here for the shtetl, right? Correct. So things have changed. I can't tell you one's better and one's worse, because I actually think anyone who's willing to pretend that it's just concretely one way or the other is totally not being reasonable to the reality. So let's look at practical application for daily life, because that's why we're here, right? When we learn for the sake of growth of our minds, but we also want to see what knowledge we can extract to walk away from. The encouragement to review. Jewish law emphasizes the importance of regular review to combat forgetting. The rabbis say that if you study every day, if you read a page of Talmud, if you go to services every morning, if you daven every day, your chances of forgetting your prayers go down because you've used them every day. However, when forgetting occurs, it's viewed not as failure, but as what? An opportunity to engage in material anew. The piece of Torah shechicha, this notion that we forget part of our crops and unlock this new mitzvah. Forgetting might happen. What will you do with that moment? How will you engage when you recognize that you've forgotten? And personal growth. Each cycle of forgetting and relearning is an opportunity for personal development. It encourages learners to delve deeper, to ask new questions, to connect more intimately with teaching. The very notion of forgetting celebrates the very gift of Torah, because we get the opportunity to read it again with fresh eyes. I wish I could reread some of my favorite stories with fresh eyes. The best I can do is to watch my kids' eyes when I read them. The best I can do is watch my students' eyes when I share with them something that blew my mind. Relearning as we go through life and forget pieces. Look, it's also a matter of, there's this beautiful illustration of filling a jar with sand. And then the teacher says, now put these rocks in the jar. And the sand is 60% high. You only get so many rocks. And the rocks are about full size of the jar. And the student says it's impossible. And the professor takes the sand and pours out of the sand into another cup, takes the empty jar and puts in the rocks and pours the sand back in. And what happens?
Yeah.
Why does it all fit? There's always more capacity for learning, but we have to clear out a certain amount of that space in order to make space for the more porous things that we'll learn, the things that won't reshape and shift around, the things that are less forgiving inside of needing our attention and focus. And then there's other things that will always be like the sand, that will flow and ebb and seep and build around it and create a more solidified memory. But you have to clear out part of it. And some of that clearing out is just the basic notion of the forgetting.
What is, I don't want to get us off track, but
I love being off track.
okay, the notion that it's like this little gift to do the one mitzvah that you can't plan. What is the modern equivalent? I do not have crops. I do not have, I do not, reap what I sow in my yard to give to someone else and forget it. So what is my equivalent of that today?
Let's throw a few out. Let's see if they stick, right?
And could everybody hear that question? Yeah.
Yeah, this microphone is great.
Yes.
You realize you dropped $5. You realize that you left the take home, the leftovers, from an amazing restaurant right on that park bench where you stopped and took a breath after dinner for a few minutes. You go back and get your leftovers. Now, one might say yes, because put them in the trash then, right? You don't want to be littering at the same time, right? I have a rule when I'm in New York City. I take leftovers from wherever I go, but the leftovers cannot make it back to the hotel. So you have two options: either get hungry enough to eat it on your walk, which rarely happens because or find someone to give the leftovers to. I don't know if it's the same thing, but it's partially there. So if you want to look at does anyone else have any ideas of what that same thing would be? But the notion is when you forget something, or maybe it's as simple as this: you loved something, you forgot about it. When you rediscover it, give it to someone who will love it, right? I have a box of yo-yos. I'll be honest, I have not opened that box in several years. The idea of giving up the collection of yo-yos should be simple. I haven't looked at them in nearly a decade. But my first thing would be like, I'm not giving away my yo-yos. But if I learned that someone really loved it, I think I would, right? Like, there are things in life that you are inherently going to forget. And then can those things bring more joy to someone else, right? Because you're right, we're not working the field, right? It's like, I have a rule at Hanukkah time. And every year I'm afraid I'm going to have to break my own rule. But so far it's been, my wife and I are arguing about this rule a little bit too. I would like them to receive gifts each night and then choose one of their own gifts to give back away. My wife tells me that is cruel and unusual. And so instead, there are 2 nights during Hanukkah in which rather than receiving gifts, we go and source and give gifts. Now, I don't think those are the same thing. And I think it's beautiful that we do that. We take the kids, they have a $20 each limit, and the goal is who can get the most awesome things for that $20 inside those stores and go and give them to those in need. But I actually want them to receive gifts and then choose to give one of them away. And I understand her idea that that feels mean. But I also think when I give something that I myself wanted or was excited for, there's a different kind of weight to it. I think that's also part of it. Or I recently told my children, you want more toys, clear out the old ones. Go down memory lane. You haven't played with Woody or Buzz. Ready to get rid of them? Because the only other method is to put it all in a bag, put it in the garage, and see if they ask about it for 3 months. I'd much rather them start the reflective journey of, is it time to get rid of this? Is it time to rehome this to someone who can play with it anew? The problem is Sometimes my kids wake up in the morning and play with something they haven't played with in a year, and they play with it as if it's brand new, and they build it again, and they have a whole world again. And in that moment, we're watching them re-engage with love with something they've forgotten. So if I purge too quickly, am I actually taking away the very opportunity that we're celebrating and uplifting in this moment? If you Marie Kondo your entire life at all times, you never get to pick something up and remember that you've forgotten it. The rabbi's understanding of forgetting Torah is a testament to the dynamic and compassionate nature of Jewish learning. Our tradition is a gift. Forgetting is not a mere lapse, but it's a vital part of a spiritual journey. It's offering a chance to rediscover, to deepen one's connection to Torah, and through that process, individuals can experience continuous growth, find ever anew meanings and joy in their studies. And this understanding highlights the beauty of our tradition that sees value in every aspect of our learning and embracing human imperfections as a pathway to that greater wisdom. It's such a brilliant gift that our tradition is willing to see our journey this way, and that our study is for the sake of constantly being on this path. I hope everyone is beginning to really walk in the path that's going to allow them to revitalize their spiritual journey. I hope everyone knows where they're going to be and where they're going to be able to engage and celebrate in our Rosh Hashanah and our Yom Kippur celebrations. And I want to remind you that they don't stop there. Sukkot and Simchat Torah are pretty important too for being back together as community and gathering. This month of Elul is a reflective month to celebrate the gifts of humanity. Before we go into our high holidays, before we reflect on our year, before we realize and recognize all the things that we want to grow and be better for. And I hope that you are in a month of meaning as we work towards that time.